All right, everyone, big news. The US Census Bureau just finally released the 2021 migration data by county and metro area around America. What does that mean? Well, it means that you can finally know just how many people moved into your city, into your county, into your metro area during the pandemic. And of course, this is something that's received a lot of attention. The big reshuffling that took place during the pandemic, people moving all around the country, and this has had a massive impact on the housing market in America. And what I'm going to do in this video is show you the granular data on just how many people actually moved to your city based on the official data from the US Census Bureau, because it's going to be really key for you to understand this if you want to know if your housing market is supported, if home prices and rents are going up because people are moving there, or conversely, as you're going to see in a lot of the cities in this video, are home prices going up because it's a big bubble? Because as we're going to see, not nearly as many people are moving to certain cities as you would have thought. And this was the big shocker to me. There's a lot of Sun Belt markets in America which are proclaiming to have a record level of migration into certain cities. They're saying, real estate investors are saying, realtors are saying that there's just so many people moving in. Yet when we look at this data from the US Census Bureau, it doesn't say that. It actually says we had a reduction in migration, and that could be the sign of a housing bubble, everyone. A reduction in migration, just as home prices and home building are going out of control. And so the way I'm going to get things started off here, and I'm going to take your requests later in the video. I'm going to start with about 10 minutes here of pre-programmed stuff, then I'm going to get to your requests, so get those ready. But we're going to start by looking at a map, and this is all of the metro areas in America that have over 100,000 people. And just pay special attention to the color coding here. So the areas in blue on this map are ones that had big inbound migration during the pandemic. Lots of people moving into the areas in blue. So we see a place like Lakeland, Florida actually increased its population by 3.4% in 1 year during the pandemic due to migration. 3.4% maybe doesn't sound like a lot to you, but it is a lot. In 1 year, that's a crazy level of growth in a place like Lakeland or a place like Northport, Sarasota, Florida. Conversely, if you go to a place like Chicago, Chicago lost 100,000 people. That was a 1% decline in its population, which is a very big decline for 1 year. And so you can see there's big differences across America. And as I go through this video, I'm going to tell you how your city is doing in terms of how many people move there. Because after all, if you're trying to buy in your local housing market and you want to understand the fundamentals of your market, the fundamentals, how many people are actually moving here, you need to understand this data. And we're actually going to get started by looking at a market that I've talked a lot about on this channel, and it would be Boise, Idaho. So you can see in Boise, we added 25,000 people due to inbound migration during the pandemic. That would be from July 2020 to June 2021. 12 months from July 2020 to June 2021, Boise added 24,000 people, a 3% increase in its population. And you can see that that type of domestic migration increase for Boise, 24,000, is a record. In the last 30 years, which we're looking at on this graph, the last 30 years of migration in Boise, we have never seen this many people move in. After all, the long-term average is about 9,200 people in a year in Boise. We got nearly 3 times that amount in 2021, which surely explains some of the craziness that's going on in Boise's housing market, why home prices and rents are up so much. Clearly has a lot to do with this migration. What I'd like to point out before getting to some more cities is that Boise had a similar jump in migration 04, 05, 06 before it came crashing down. So one thing I want you guys to remember is that this surge in migration helps explain what happened in Boise's housing market, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this migration surge is sustainable, which is something I'm going to talk more about later. Another market that had a big jump in migration was Sarasota, Florida. We're looking at Northport, Sarasota, Florida here. 30,000 plus 30,000 in 2021, which is 3 times more than the long-term average, according to this US Census Bureau data in Sarasota. So you're saying to yourself, all right, legitimately, lots of people are moving to Southwest Florida. If we were to look at a place like Naples or Cape Coral, it would look similar. Record number of people moving in helps explain what's going on in the housing market. Again, I would like to point you to what happened in the mid-2000s. We had a big run-up and a big drop. So again, this doesn't mean that Northport, Sarasota will continue to do this, but assuredly in 2020, 2021, it had a massive surge of people moving in. Now, at the other end of the spectrum would be a place like, let's look at Dallas, Texas. So Dallas is a market, which we're looking at here, the Dallas-Fort Worth Metro, which is a big migration market. You can tell. Positive numbers every single year. 50,000, 90,000, 75,000. But what do you notice, everyone? Dallas had 63,000 positive migration in 2021. That is actually right at the long-term average over the last 30 years. So, we have a place like Sarasota where we have this boom in migration. But then we have a place like Dallas where the migration's good, but it's actually lower than it was in 2015, 2016. So this is something that's curious. And, we're going to see it with some more cities that I look at in a second, is that a lot of cities did not do nearly as well as you would have thought they did on these migration figures, which the US Census Bureau tracks this migration data annually. And they do it by looking at tax filings and healthcare filings. So if you move somewhere and change your address and file your taxes or your new healthcare forms, that's how the US Census Bureau knows you moved. So this is a very kind of official way to recognize someone moving and changing their address. And we can see in a place like Dallas, good migration, actually lower than it used to be. We can see that something similar is in a place like Las Vegas, Nevada. Take a look at Las Vegas, everyone. This one floored me because I'm looking at the long-term average in Las Vegas of 38,000 people per year moving into Las Vegas. And I'm looking at, we only had 15,000 in 2021. We were about, let's just say, 60% below the long-term average in our Vegas migration figures in 2021. I don't think anyone expected that. I sure didn't expect that Vegas actually looks pretty bad by these metrics. And it suggests that the Vegas housing market, if you're banking on like legitimate migration and growth to support the market, maybe you shouldn't. Because these figures are saying Vegas had one of its worst migration years in the last 3 decades during 2021, during the pandemic. Now, an interesting way to analyze this data is to not just look at inbound migration, because after all, I think you all know, real estate is a mixture of demand and supply. The migration, how many people are moving in based off those tax filings and those healthcare filings, would be the demand side of the equation, right? But what about the supply side? That's just as important. How many homes are getting permitted and built? That's a question we also need to ask, because it's really the interaction of the demand and the supply that's going to determine what happens in your local housing market in the future. And so let's take a look at this now, everyone. Let's take a look at comparing the demand, which is the blue line, the migration in Vegas, to the supply, the number of housing permits for new apartments and homes, the orange line. And then what do we see is that actually in 2021, we had more permitting in Vegas than, and what do we see is that in 2021, we actually had more permitting in Vegas than we had migration in Vegas. 16,000 permits, 15,000 migration. So we actually had a deficit in demand in Vegas in 2021 in the housing market. That's only the 5th time in the last 30 years that that's happened in Las Vegas, where builders went and permitted more new homes and apartments than the amount of people who moved there. Let's take a look at Dallas, Texas, everyone. Go back to Dallas. We can see in Dallas that the housing permits, like in Vegas, actually exceeded the migration total in 2021. And so this is a trend that we're seeing actually in a lot of Sunbelt markets, is that on one hand, you go to buy a home right now in Dallas or Vegas and you can't find anything, right? Like there's nothing on the market in Dallas or Vegas for you to buy. So you're saying to yourself, well, then these markets are undersupplied and there's too much demand. But then when we look at the fundamental data, we see that that is actually not the case. That the fundamental data from the US Census Bureau on how many people are moving in versus how many homes and apartments are being permitted and built are saying Dallas and Vegas are being oversupplied with housing right now. And that's something that I think maybe a lot of you are going to struggle with, understanding. I kind of struggled with it at first. The fact that we could be in a market like Dallas where we have a tremendous shortage of homes on the market, yet this orange line, housing permits, is above this blue line, migration. And so what that suggests is that while in Dallas and the other markets I'm going to show you real soon, it suggests that while today's housing market is crazy, from a fundamental perspective into the future, there's going to be softening. There's not enough people are actually moving there to support how many homes are being permitted and built. And maybe in the short term, builders are having trouble delivering the permits, right? We've all heard of the construction issues and the backlog on materials and the labor shortages. So maybe like a builder pulls a permit and they're not able to build it right away, which could be explaining the shortage right now. But eventually the builders are going to build those permits and they're going to need the people there in the city to move in to the housing units. And I'm not sure that that's going to happen in a place like Dallas or take a look at Nashville, everyone. Take a look at Nashville. Nashville now has 3 years in a row where this orange line, building permits, is above the migration total. So Nashville, that's 3 years in a row where builders are building too much, it seems like, right? When we see this orange line above this blue line, again, this is data from the US Census Bureau on how many people are moving in versus how many buildings for apartments and homes are being permitted. And we're looking over 30 years, and we can actually see that Nashville is building way more now than it ever has relative to how many people are moving there. And this is crazy, folks. This suggests that there's a bubble going on in some of these southeast housing markets like Nashville, or let's take a look at Atlanta. Let's take a look at Atlanta. In Atlanta, we cross this threshold where housing permits are now above migration in 2021 in Atlanta. So, folks, this is a situation that I think really you need to be concerned about if you're a home buyer or a real estate investor today. Because I think what's happening is a lot of you might be getting seduced into thinking there's a legitimate structural shortage of housing in some of these Sunbelt markets. Because it seems like there's nothing on the market. But then when you, again, dig into that fundamental data in Nashville, in Atlanta, in Dallas, you realize that, well, from a fundamental perspective, more homes are being permitted than there are people moving to these areas. And so this is something you need to watch out for. Maybe this is not going to impact the market right now, but over the next 12 months, maybe it is. Maybe builders are going to start to catch up on all of these permits and deliver these new homes, and maybe there's not enough people to buy. I know that sounds crazy right now, given what you're seeing in the housing market. But again, this is a fundamental perspective. Forget active inventory. We're looking at how many people are moving in, how many homes are being built. And I want to encourage a lot of you to look into this fundamental data before you decide to pull the trigger on a home in a housing market that, you're convinced there's a shortage. But when we look at the fundamental data, we say to ourselves, I don't know, folks, there certainly doesn't seem like there's a shortage in Atlanta. And by the way, we're looking now at Atlanta, Georgia again, and this is migration. This is just migration. Atlanta, last 30 years, has averaged 55,000 people moving in per year over the last 30 years. That's the typical year in Atlanta. We were at 25,000 in 2021. So Atlanta was actually 50% below its long-term historical norm in terms of people moving into the metro area. And this is not just the city of Atlanta, this is the metro area. This includes, I'll show you what this includes actually. This includes all of the counties around the center of Atlanta, as well as, just give me a second here to take this map over. This includes all the counties around the center of Atlanta, as well as all the suburban counties, as we can see here. So this would be like the Atlanta metro area. And we can see there's big differences in terms of gain and loss. The areas in red lost, or translucent kind of lost, and the areas in blue in the suburbs and rural areas gained. But net, Atlanta added fewer people in 2021 than it did in the previous years, and way fewer than it was even 5 years ago. And so, this is something you all really need to focus on. Did less people actually move to my city? And, I'm harping on this, and I'm going to get to your request in just 2 minutes. But I'm harping on this because I believe there was a lie, so to speak, or a false narrative perpetrated in the mainstream press, in the housing markets in some of these cities, that said there were so many people that moved in the pandemic. And we're seeing from the hard data that that wasn't actually the case in some of these cities. It was certainly the case in Boise and Sarasota, or a place like Knoxville, Tennessee gained a lot of people. But it wasn't the case in Dallas or Atlanta or Vegas. They actually added fewer people during the pandemic. And so I'm beginning to think that there's a bit of a false narrative going on about just how many people are actually moving into these areas. And it suggests that potentially, rather than fundamental demand and people moving in supporting these markets, it's speculation, it's investor demand, it's people buying second homes, which maybe can support the market for a short period of time, but at some point you're going to need those migration figures to get up to support the level of demand in the housing market, or to support the prices, I should say, in the housing market. All right, everyone, I'm about ready to take your requests, so let's get into it. What markets do you want me to cover as far as this goes? All right, I see some requests here for Seattle. This is a great one. Seattle is a great market to cover because this is a market, everyone, that actually lost people during the pandemic. Seattle lost people during the pandemic, and this is minus 24,000 people, which is minus 0.6%. That doesn't look terrible, right? Like minus 0.6%. But when we look at it in terms of how Seattle's doing compared to its history, which we're going to look at here in a second, we see that, oh boy, minus 24,000 is really bad. Like on average, Seattle over the last 30 years is plus 24,000, and now we're minus 24,000. That's horrible. And this is actually the first time ever in its history, at least the last 30 years, that Seattle has meaningfully moved into negative territory in terms of people leaving the city and the metro. So this is a concern for Seattle's housing market, which, you say to yourself today, all right, Seattle's housing market's crazy. There's bidding wars, inventory's low. But when you look at this data, it's saying that potentially that's not going to last for too long because we're losing people in Seattle in a way that we've never lost people. We've only gained people before in a place like Seattle. Now, I got a request for Oklahoma City, which is a very different market than Seattle. So let's take a look at Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City, you could see, is the exact opposite. We actually did really well in 2021 in OKC. 10,000 people moved in. That's above the long-term average of 7,000. It's actually below where it was maybe 10 years ago, but still positive. So Oklahoma City would be another one of these southern markets where there was good migration during the pandemic, but it was actually less than it was, say, 6 years ago in a place like Oklahoma City. While we're on the topic of Oklahoma, let's take a look at Tulsa. Tulsa is an interesting one. It's kind of bounced around. We're looking at Tulsa right now. We're plus 7,200 during the pandemic, which is about double the long-term average. So Tulsa, good migration market during the pandemic, but again, not substantially higher than it did in previous years in a place like Tulsa. I think a place like Charlotte also is worth taking a look at. Let's look at Charlotte, North Carolina. This is another one in Charlotte where we did plus 27,000 people moving during the pandemic. That is actually slightly below the long-term average in Charlotte. The long-term average is 27,000 people a year. We were at 27,000. Actually, lower than it was in the previous 5 years by quite a bit. The amount of people moving into Charlotte was lower over the last year or so than it was in 2016, 2017. And again, this is shocking to me. You can see actually in 06, 07, Charlotte had a much more legitimate surge in migration back then. Why don't we take a look at Phoenix? Because Phoenix is a very interesting one for this discussion as well. You can see it looks kind of similar to Charlotte. We had this big run-up in 05, 06 in Phoenix in terms of migration, then a big crash in migration, then we worked our way up. But then take a look at this, folks. We peaked in 2020, went down by about 25% in 2021 from where it was in 2020. So Phoenix, one of the top migration markets in America, legitimately, no one can argue with that, but we see we went down from a couple years ago and we're way down from the previous peak in 05, 06 in Phoenix. So, I'm left scratching my head and I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on this. Why is it that a place like Phoenix that the home prices are up 35% and the rent's up 25%. And the narrative in Phoenix is that so many people are moving there, but actually fewer people are moving into Phoenix now than 2 years ago. How do we square that? How do we make sense of that? It's something I'm struggling to make sense of. It suggests to me again that there's lots of speculation supporting the housing market in a place like Phoenix rather than legitimate people moving in, which is happening to some degree, but not enough to support the type of rent growth and price growth in Phoenix. So it suggests investors are buying and selling homes. It suggests maybe second home buyers are entering the market and basically feeding off this narrative. It's a narrative, right, that the pandemic introduced a new situation that we've never seen before and that more people are moving to Phoenix than ever before. That's the narrative. We know it's not true. We know it's not true by this data from the US Census Bureau. And let's get a couple more requests, everyone. What markets do you want me to cover in terms of migration? Very important for you to understand this. Very important for you guys to understand this. All right, I see a request now for Portland, Oregon, which is a great market to look at. So let's look at Portland. Portland lost people, minus 6,300. Portland lost minus 6,300, minus 0.3%. So that, slight loss doesn't look too bad. But again, folks, let's take a closer look at Portland to see what's going on here. And we can see, this actually doesn't look so good in Portland because, we have a marginal loss in migration, minus 6,300. But we see that on average, compared to what Portland used to be, this is terrible. This is horrible because Portland's usually plus 22,000. And then it's been below that level now for 3 years in a row and then finally went negative for the first time in its history. This was the first time ever in Portland, Oregon that we had negative migration in Portland. And so, again, like Seattle, it looks very similar to what we saw in Seattle. And this says to me there's problems coming in these housing markets because they're losing people in the Pacific Northwest, in these big Pacific Northwest cities. We're losing people for the first time ever. Never happened before. And we're likely to lose more people in Portland and Seattle in 2022 as the prices are out of control and the interest and mortgage rates are going out of control. So this data makes me really concerned about a place like Portland, Oregon. Of course, we looked at Boise before, but let's take a look maybe at another Pacific Northwest market like a Spokane, Washington, we can see is doing better. Clearly, Spokane is gaining some of the people leaving Portland and Seattle. Spokane was plus 6,700 above the long-term average of 4,000. And so, in the same region, you can have very different things going on in terms of how many people are moving in and out. And very clearly, there's a cluster in the Pacific Northwest, but it's really more towards the mountain areas where we see a lot of blue in Kalispell, Montana, and Bozeman, and Idaho Falls, and Boise, and Bend, that lots of people moved in. We also had people move into Prescott Valley, Arizona, Lake Havasu City, Arizona, Provo, Utah. But interestingly, Salt Lake City lost people. Salt Lake City lost people during the pandemic. I don't think a lot of people would have expected that Salt Lake would have been a net loser. Denver lost people during the pandemic, everyone. Let's take a look at what's going on in Denver's market in terms of migration. Interesting. Similar trend. Are you guys noticing this trend with these expensive mountain and Pacific Northwest markets? Like long term, Denver's plus 24,000 a year. Now we're minus 5,000. The first time in Denver's history in 30 years that we actually lost a substantial amount of people. Look at this, folks. We're normally here in Denver, and then we're here during the pandemic. We're losing people in Denver. As I said before, we're losing people in Salt Lake City, which has some experience losing people before. You can see there was an exodus from Salt Lake in the early 2000s, but normally we're plus 2,400. Now we're minus 4,000. And so, I think this is something you guys really got to pay attention to. If you're in a market and your migration went down, but yet your housing market's booming right now, be careful, because it suggests that maybe the fundamentals aren't really there to support the market. Why don't we take a look now at some places in the Midwest? We see Chicago lost people. I talked about that before. Detroit lost people. And we see, a lot of places in the Midwest did lose people. The Midwest typically is a net loser in terms of migration. You'll see Pittsburgh, Detroit, Chicago, most years will lose people, but it's really more about like the change. How's the change in migration in Chicago? Well, in Chicago, it's pretty bad. Normally, we average minus 25,000 in Chicago. 2021, we're minus 100,000. So Chicago definitely lost more people than its long-term average and even the previous years. A place like Pittsburgh, let's take a look at what Pittsburgh did in terms of migration. Pittsburgh was more or less at its long-term average in terms of a slight loss, so not a huge deal. What about Detroit, Michigan? What about Detroit? Let's take a look at Detroit. Detroit lost 16,000, right around the long-term average. So we have certain Midwest markets like Pittsburgh and Detroit, which lost a normal amount of people, but then we have like Chicago, which lost a ton of people. And since we're on this theme of markets that lost the most, we got to talk about New York. We got to talk about what's going on in New York, because it was very bad. I think a lot of you know that New York was a big net loser. I don't think many of you know just how much it lost. Take a look at this, everyone. On average, the New York metro, not just New York City, but the metro area, including Long Island and Westchester and all those places, would lose 55,000 people a year. It lost 362,000 during the pandemic. So it literally lost 7 times more than normal New York metro area. And this is going to be one where I'm going to bring the county map up for you guys again, because you're going to want to see the differences in New York that occurred in different counties, because we'll see big differences. So if we zoom in here, apologize for the scrolling. So if we zoom in here, Manhattan got crushed, everyone. Manhattan lost 7% of its population in 1 year due to domestic outbound migration. Horrible. It's never happened before in Manhattan's history. 3 times more than the previous worst. So literally the exodus from Manhattan and Queens and Brooklyn and Bronx and even Hudson County, New Jersey was as bad as they said. These areas got crushed. The interesting question is, are they going to rebound now going into 2022? I have some thoughts on that going forward in future videos. But what's also interesting is that around New York, Westchester still lost people. Nassau County still lost people. Essex County still lost people. Bergen County still lost people. So it wasn't as if like everyone left Manhattan and then went to Westchester. Westchester still lost people as well. So the New York area was just like a net loser during the pandemic by all accounts, especially in Manhattan. As was a place like Boston, would be kind of interesting to look at. The Boston metro, and this is one that's actually pretty bad when you think of the relative differential, because so Boston lost 37,000. That's nothing compared to New York's 370,000. But when you compare it to like what Boston does normally, which is positive migration, plus 37,000 is pretty bad. And I would point you guys to 04, 05 was like the last time Boston lost this many people. And it's interesting that now in 2021, we're seeing a similar level of loss, kind of coincides with the last housing bubble. I don't think Boston's like in a massive housing bubble, certainly not as big as it was last time, but this is something that bears watching in a place like Boston. How many people left the metro area? It was a lot during 2021. It was a lot during 2021. All right, everyone, let's get some more requests. I know we've got a lot of markets to cover. I know a lot of you want to know how many people are moving to your area. Okay, the requests are coming in fast and furious, having trouble keeping track. Let's see. San Jose, California. All right, let's take a look at San Jose. We can see minus 2 minus 2.5% migration in 2021 in San Jose. That's one of the worst of any metro area. In fact, I think that was second worst to San Francisco in percentage terms. So lots of people left San Jose. But again, devil's in how this compares to the past, right? And we can see San Jose legitimately had its worst migration loss ever in 2021. Normally, it only loses about 2,000 people a year. Now it lost 49,000 people a year, even more than it lost in the tech bust in '02, which is crazy because the tech bust crushed San Jose back in '02. We lost more people during the pandemic, and we haven't even had a tech bust yet. So if we actually do have a tech bust, which I think a dot-com bust 2.0 could occur in 2022, San Jose probably stands to lose even more people. So this does not look great for San Jose right now with these big migration losses. All right, everyone, what other requests do we got here? What other requests do we got, everyone? Sacramento, that's a great one to look at because Sacramento would be a potential gainer in terms of people leaving San Jose and San Francisco. What we can see is all right, so Sacramento did have positive migration in 2021, plus 8,000, but it was actually below the long-term average and wasn't even close to the levels of 47, 45,000 in the early 2000s. So Sacramento, you say is a positive migration market, one of the few places in California that's good, but we're not pulling the amount of people I think we need to pull into Sacramento to sustain home prices. And we were pulling a lot more in 15, 16, and 17 than we are today. And why don't we take a look at how this looks in relation to permits in Sacramento? And we can see now we have 2 years in a row where the permits in Sacramento are more than the migration. 2 years in a row where the permits are more, the orange line is the permits, are more than the migration. 2 years in a row, that's a concern. It suggests we could be overbuilding in Sacramento. Maybe no one realizes we're overbuilding yet because the inventory on the market's low, but from a structural standpoint, maybe we are because the permits exceed the migration levels. All right, what are some other requests here? Orlando. Glad someone requested Orlando because that's one that we need to pay attention to. Because there's some potential issues going on in Orlando. So now we have in Orlando, and I apologize, guys, I got to make a slight adjustment to this graph. All right, everyone. So now we have in Orlando 3 years in a row where the orange line permits is greater than migration, the blue line. And I think this is going to come as a shock to anyone in Orlando. Because you're probably hearing a narrative of so many people are moving in, but actually 2021 was the second worst year in the last 3 decades for Orlando's migration. I mean, that's not good and makes certain degree of sense, right? The pandemic negatively impacted leisure and hospitality, which Orlando relies on, so maybe some people left, but we permitted 30,000 housing units in 2021, only added 10,000 people. Probably not great, probably means at a certain point, Orlando's housing market is going to have too many homes being built for the amount of people that live there. Now, how about, someone's requesting Northport, Sarasota, the same analysis on permits and people moving there. So let's take a look. And so we can see Northport's a different situation. The housing permits are still well below the migration. We can see the migration's up here, the permits are down here. So this would indicate a more substantial and legitimate shortage of homes being built in Sarasota, Northport, given, again, the fact that the blue line, migration, is above the orange line, housing permits. So in Northport, as well as Naples, Florida, I think would tell a similar picture. Yeah, Naples would tell a similar picture where the migration is well above the building permits. But I would caution you, everyone, on this market, because take a look at what happened in Naples going back to 2000, 2003. We had a couple years in a row of migration being above permits, and then migration just fell off the table. And so this is a risk that you got to think about in any type of market, like a Naples and Northport, a Sarasota, even a Boise, any place that had this epic surge in migration above the long-term historical average, which provides legitimacy to what we saw in the housing market. The trouble is, when you look at the historical data, these type of migration surges never seem to be sustainable, and they're often followed by not just a normalization in migration, but a crash in migration. Look at what happened in Naples. It went from 10,000 in 2005 to literally none in 2007. So that's something you do got to be mindful of. You'd say to yourself in Naples, okay, legitimate shortage, but be mindful that the migration can drop off just as quickly as it started, which is something to look at. I got a request for Austin, Texas, so let's take a look at Austin, everyone. So Austin's an interesting one. We have a long period in Austin where the migration is above the level of permitting, right? We could see the blue line above the orange line. But then, like many other markets in 2021, we basically reached a new threshold where for the first time, the permitting is above the migration in Austin. So now we're building more homes and apartments in Austin than people are moving there. And so that's definitely a concern. Austin's building more homes and apartments than any other market in America. And the thing to remember is that Austin for 2 to 3 decades really had a balanced housing market. This relationship of migration and permitting led to like 3% per year price growth. And then all of a sudden now we get 45% price growth when there's more homes being permitted than people moving there. Got to make you step back and take a look and wonder how legitimate is what's going on in Austin's housing market right now. What about San Antonio to the south of Austin? What's going on there? So we can see San Antonio still is keeping that migration figure above that permitting figure. So 26,000 migration in 2021 is above that 19,000 permitting figure. We see the permits are rising fast. And a permit might take a year, might take 2 years to turn into a completed home. So it's a bit of a forward-looking indicator. But we can see that San Antonio still has a decent lead in terms of migration above its levels of permitting. And why don't we round off with Houston since we're covering Texas right now. Houston, Texas, and ooh, boy, all right. So Houston's one that does not look great by this metric. We can see that for 4 or 5 years in a row now, the permits, the orange line, have been substantially above the migration, the blue line in Houston, Texas. So, that could be one of the reasons why Houston has not been as crazy as the other housing markets in Texas over the last year or two, because we have maybe more supply in Houston relative to how many people are moving there. One thing to think about in Houston, we had crazy migration in 14-15. Like 100,000 people in 14-15. Houston's heavily related to oil. So we had an oil boom, 13, 14, 15, people moved in. I suspect Houston's going to climb in the migration numbers going forward now due to the fact that oil prices are above $100 a barrel. So maybe be a little concerned with how much building there is in Houston, but I would think compared to other markets, we're going to see migration go up in Houston into the future. All right, everyone, I'm going to get, I have time for another maybe 3 requests. So get these requests in. What do we got, everyone? Where do you want to see? All right, we got a Bakersfield, California request. So let's take a look at Bakersfield. Where's Bakersfield? All right, so Bakersfield was basically flat in 2021, added some people due to migration in 2021, plus 0.3% in Bakersfield. So again, this is one where it's helpful to compare over time. So over time in Bakersfield, we can actually see that normally the migration was negative. People were leaving Bakersfield in most years, but then like in 2020, we had minus 3,400, but then we went to plus 2,800 in Bakersfield in 2021. So interestingly, you could see probably Bakersfield benefited from people leaving Los Angeles because it went from minus, then went to plus. And this was actually the first year that Bakersfield migration eclipsed permitting. So this is an interesting housing market that's much more affordable than other areas in California, normally loses people, gained a lot of people back in the mid-2000s, but was losing people since then, had a bit of a bump during the pandemic in Bakersfield. While we're looking at that, let's look at Riverside, California. Cover another Central Valley market here. We can see Riverside had plus 34,000 migration in 2021. That's pretty good. That was actually the biggest nominal migration increase of any market in America in Riverside in 2021 compared to only 15,000 housing permits. And so we can see there's probably somewhat of a legitimate shortage of housing in Riverside. What I think this is amusing, though, is if you go back to the mid-2000s, you can tell Riverside, like, the growth was way better in the mid-2000s than it is today. And so that's another important thing to remember, guys, is like a lot of these markets, the so-called pandemic beneficiary markets, way more people were moving there back in the mid-2000s. Like 3 times as many people were moving to Riverside back in '04 than did in 2021. So like, I don't know exactly what that says. I think it says that if you're banking on like any permanent, like real increase from the pandemic being above and beyond what a market like Riverside has seen before, don't count on it because, again, folks, plus 34,000, good. Not as good as '04-05, better than it was a couple years ago in a place like Riverside. And, I showed you guys Phoenix before, but I want to show you it again because it looks pretty similar here. Phoenix is another market. Now we got the permits, by the way, on this Phoenix graph. I know someone asked for that earlier. Phoenix is always a market where the migration's higher than the permitting. So it's kind of always that way. But actually, we see the permits going up, and up, and the migration now dipping down in Phoenix. So the differential here of 20,000 is actually the lowest it's been in a long time in a place like Phoenix. So this is something to watch out for, everyone. And I'm going to get to my last 3 requests in 1 second, but I just want you guys to recognize the difference between, how should I say, like fundamental supply and demand versus, let's just call it like tertiary or surface level supply and demand. Like surface level supply and demand involves inventory on the market and how many homes are available and how many buyers there are. And clearly that's meaningful to influence home prices. But surface level supply and demand can be influenced by a lot of different things. Like I said before, investors, second home buyers, a delay in a builder delivering a home to the market. All these things can constrain inventory in the short term and make the market look a lot more supply and constrained than actually the fundamentals say it is. Because the fundamentals, and why this is so important for you all to understand this data, the fundamentals truly are how many people are moving in, how many homes are being built. That's really what matters in terms of the fundamentals of the market. And my belief, and you can disagree with me on this if you want, but my belief is at a certain point, the surface level supply and demand is going to regress towards the fundamental supply and demand. And the fundamental is going to rule the day at a certain point in time. I think it's going to be at some point in 2022. Maybe in certain markets it'll be in 2023. But you can only put off the fundamentals for so long. And that's why the data that we're looking at is so important. So let's get back into our last 3 requests, everyone. I'm taking my last 3 requests before I sign off. Get your requests in right now before I go. All right, we got a request for Kansas City, Missouri. All right, let's look at Kansas City, give the Midwest some love. So you can see Kansas City was flat. Migration was flat, slightly up in 2021. Let's take a look at the migration versus permit data in Kansas City. All right, so this doesn't look great, guys. So, Kansas City is normally like a positive migration market, but our migration in 2021 was below where it was a couple years ago. 15, 16, 17 was a peak. And our building now, our permitting is a lot more than our migration in Kansas City. So this could be the sign that we're going to have some softness in the Kansas City housing market going forward, that we're going to be adding more homes and apartments than there are people to live in them. I don't think Kansas City is going to have a crash, so to speak. It's, the prices there are still somewhat reasonable compared to wages, but this says that there could be some problems ahead in the market. All right. What about Knoxville, Tennessee? That's a great one, everyone, because Knoxville's a market that had a legitimate boom in people moving in. Look at that. Went from 10,000 to 14,000 in Knoxville. That's more than the 11,000 peak in '06, and that's way more than the amount of homes and apartments being permitted. And so that's something that gives credence to the Knoxville housing market and suggests that some of what we're seeing is legitimate in terms of there are a lot of people moving in there and not enough homes and apartments being permitted in Knoxville. Of course, that doesn't mean that home prices can't go down in Knoxville, but it just suggests that to this point, things seem supported. The concern here would be that the migration level isn't sustainable, and at some point it's going to go down pretty hard towards the long-term average while the home building ticks up. It's an interesting comparison to Nashville, which I talked about before. Nashville is the opposite, and everyone, look at this. For now 3 years in a row in Nashville, the permits are above the migration, substantially so. And actually, more people moved to Knoxville than Nashville in the last year during the pandemic. So that's something that's got to be concerning about Nashville's housing market. All right, everyone. I see some more requests flowing in. What I would encourage a lot of you to do after I sign off is to go back and rewatch the video, because I covered some of the cities that you're requesting already, like Houston I already covered, Arizona, parts of Arizona I already covered. So go back and watch the replay. But we're going to end things with Pensacola, Florida. Pensacola, Florida. And actually, I'm going to do one more after this one. I'm going to do one more after this one in Florida. But we can see Pensacola migration, 5,600, down from where it was in 2019, 2020. And the permits are now getting pretty close to that level of migration. So, Pensacola probably did not build enough housing in 16, 17, 18, but starting to get close to building enough now. This is a market where I think there could be some downside. I don't think Pensacola is in a massive bubble, but you got to watch this declining migration figure in Pensacola. And then actually, I want to take a look at Miami real quick, everyone, because this was an interesting one. Get ready for this, everyone. Oh boy, Miami lost 32,000 people during the pandemic. This one surprised me. I did not expect this, Miami to lose so many people. And this looks oddly similar to what happened in 06, 07 in Miami, where it's like positive migration, then wham, negative migration out of nowhere in Miami, well below the housing permitting. So this is one that actually shocked me. I did not expect Miami to be in such negative territory in 2021. I have a suspicion it's going to bounce back in 2022, because the leisure and hospitality sector in Miami got hit negatively. But Miami is one that does not look great by these metrics. All right, and actually, last one. Let's do Bozeman, Montana. I got a request for Bozeman. Don't have the permitting data for Bozeman, unfortunately, but we have the migration data. 2,800 people in Bozeman. That's more than the historical average, less than it was a couple years ago. So again, another one where we had an increase in migration, but it was less than it used to be. All right, everyone. So look, here's the things you need to remember about this migration data. And I'm going to have more content on this in coming weeks because there's a lot to unpack from this migration data. Make sure you're a subscriber if you're not already so you can see this content. Additionally, I'm going to be giving this content first and foremost to my channel members. I'm going to have a lot of content on this and interactive graphs for my channel members. So if you want access to that, hit the join button below. The cost is $5 a month. But again, fundamentals. How many people are moving to the market? How many homes are being built? To me, that's what matters in the long run. Historically, that's what the data suggests. That's what it matters for the housing market. And in the short term, these fundamentals can get skewed. They can get skewed, and investors and second home buyers can skew things. But in the long run, you need people to move to the cities. To fill the homes that are being built and permitted once those homes get built. So that's why this data is so important. I'm going to have more content on this into the future. Thank you for joining everyone today. Make sure you're a subscriber. Make sure to hit the like button. If I didn't cover your city, leave a comment in the comments section below on the video after it posts. I'll try to get to it.